Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Marko Antonsic. I'm the convener of the Loughborough University Nationalism Network. It's my great pleasure to have today Brooklyn Walker, all the way from Knoxville, Tennessee. So thank you for being here, Brooklyn. So let me say a few words about Brooklyn and then a few in-house guidelines. So Brooklyn Walker, she's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, in the Department of Political Science. She has just moved there and she's settling well. So far, so good. Her research explores the intersection of religious ideas and identities with political attitudes. And particularly, she draws on scholarship and she contributes to scholarship on public opinion, political psychology, political behavior, gender and politics, and racial and ethnic politics. Quite a long list. It's good to see actually this interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary engagement. Her work has been published in Political Behavior, Public Opinion Quarterly, Politics and Religion, and the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion. And for LUNN today, she will be talking about the intersection between race, religion, and nation, focusing very much on the US, something that I personally looking forward given how much topical is this topic. So she will be talking for about 30, 40 minutes, and there will be time for questions. We are aiming to finish at 5 p.m. UK time. As usual, I would invite everyone maybe to close the microphone. Only Brooklyn will obviously have the microphone on, and also close the camera. I guess that everybody already has the camera closed. I will also close my own camera. And yeah, so the floor is for you, Brooklyn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I've been looking forward to giving this talk for a while now, and I've really appreciated the invitation and then all the logistical support that Marco's provided. So as was described in the introduction, I study Christian nationalism in the United States. I am going to kind of cover some background about the United States context and then also Christian nationalism as it presents itself in the United States. So I know that many of you are already well versed in this topic, so I'm sorry for any redundancy, but just wanted to kind of present the particular context where I'm coming from and discussing. So I am looking forward to our discussion. My talk for today is titled A Christian Nation for All, Race and Christian Nationalism in the United States. So during the talk today, we're going to address 5 different topics. So first, we'll do kind of a brief overview of the racial, ethnic, and religious landscape of the United States. Then we'll talk a bit about how we think about Christian nationalism in the United States context, how that's been conceptualized recently in the literature. Third, we'll discuss some of the kind of theoretical frameworks or stories that link Christian nationalism to whiteness. Fourth, we'll look at the distribution of Christian nationalism across different racial groups. And then finally, we'll explore if Christian nationalism has racialized effects, and if so, try to develop an understanding for why it does or when it does. So we're going to start by just getting a bit of a snapshot of the United States. So we've been a multiracial country for as long as we have been around. This is a map of Native American tribes superimposed over the current boundaries of the states within the United States. This is the map of where these various tribes lived prior to colonization. And so you can see that there's already a lot of diversity here. And you've got considerable population across the country. Even though we're best known for colonization that's coming from Europe, it's not as though whites are the only people that are coming to the United States. In 1619, we have the first enslaved Africans that arrive on the shores. And by the time you get to 1770, which is what this map represents, you have considerable numbers of enslaved Africans that are living throughout the 13 colonies. While some colonies have relatively slim slim enslaved populations, places like New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Other states like Georgia and South Carolina are majority enslaved Africans. So again, we've got quite a bit of racial diversity even before the United States is established as a country. Another ethnic group that's been important to the United States are Latinos. As the country expanded westward, it came in contact with more and more territories where there were sizable Latino populations. This is a map from 1870. And it shows the number of Latinos that are living in each of the states that were states at the time. So you can see that there are, again, thousands and thousands of Latinos that were part of the American story. So historically, we've always been a racially diverse country, and that has become increasingly true over time. In 1969, the U.S. passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which eliminated quotas that had favored immigration from Western Europe, and that allowed for immigration from more diverse parts of the world. So in combination with increased diversity, plus different rates of natural growth within populations in the United States, we've seen the country become more and more racially diverse. So this graph charts the proportion of the population that falls into the main racial groups from 1980 to 2020. You can see that the proportion of the population that's white has shrunk over time. The population that is Hispanic, Asian, American Indian, or Pacific Islander has grown over time. So the country is becoming more diverse. And it's anticipated, given these trends, that by 2040, the United States will be a majority minority nation, which means that whites will constitute less than 50% of the population by around 2040. That's important to note. Even though the country has always been racially diverse, it doesn't mean that that all racial groups have been equally integrated into the country. The extension of citizenship and of voting rights to racial minorities has been slow, and the idea of the U.S. as a multiracial democracy is actually relatively recent. Next, we'll turn to the religious landscape of the United States. So religion, Christianity in particular, has been part of the founding myth of the United States. I remember growing up in central Kansas, every Thanksgiving, we would always enact a pageant of the Pilgrims unloading at Plymouth Rock off of the Mayflower. And religion was very much part of that story. The Pilgrims had left Europe in order to find religious freedom and to be able to practice their religion as they felt led to in the United States. That this founding story was an important part of what made the United States the country that it was. So Christianity has been part of the founding myth of the United States, but there's always been quite a bit of religious diversity. If we think back to the original colonies, many of them had different dominant religious traditions. Pennsylvania was Quaker, New York was Dutch Reformed, Maryland was Catholic, Georgia and Virginia centered on the Church of England. So you have different denominations that have different geographical concentrations. There are also populations of Muslims and of Jews that live in the United States. So non-Christians were here before and at the time of the founding. During the Great Awakening, there's a religious revival that sweeps the country that continues to increase religious diversity, especially among Protestant denominations, where we see the growth of Methodism and Baptist churches that are reaching farther and farther west. But all that said, the United States also in part has a diverse landscape because there hasn't been an established national church. Now, that choice was an intentional one. Within the Constitution and the First Amendment, there's language that directly prohibits the establishment of religion that is interpreted as meaning that government is not to endorse any state religion or to favor one religion over another or to favor religion over non-religion. And the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution also explicitly protects the free exercise of religion, which has been interpreted to mean people's ability to practice their faith as they see fit. These different elements of the First Amendment in particular indicate that the US has a pretty low level of religious regulation coming from the state. And that has enabled lots of different faiths to take root within the country. So this graph right here shows the religious composition of the US starting in 1972 and going to 2022. And there's a couple of major trends to note. So over time, the religious composition of the US has changed. Mainline denominations, which are represented by the yellowish orange line, have experienced some pretty considerable decline. The evangelical community has as well. That's the blue line here in this chart, although its decline has been less significant. Other religions have increased slightly. These would include various non-Christian faiths. These are represented by kind of the purplish gray line near the bottom. There's been a slight uptick in the people who adhere to other faiths. And then most significantly has been what we call the rise of the nuns, or folks who are unaffiliated from any particular religion. That's the brown line here, and you can see that sharp uptick in the number of people who say that they don't have any particular religious affiliation. So in the future, it's anticipated that these religious transitions, these trends will continue, that Christianity will continue to decline. These are Pew's estimates of what the demography will look like going out to 2070, and that the percentage of Americans that belong to other faiths or that are religiously unaffiliated will increase. So this data all points to a country that is also quite religiously diverse. So next we're going to turn to talking a little bit about Christian nationalism in the American context. So it's been conceptualized by scholars in various ways. Whitehead and Perry talk about Christian nationalism as a cultural framework, as a collection of myths or traditions, symbols, narratives, value systems that idealize and advocate a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. So bringing together the religion of Christianity with American political institutions and political behavior. Djupe and colleagues talk about Christian nationalism as a set of beliefs that the nation is of, meaning primarily constituted of, by, meaning founded by, and for Christians. And other scholars like Anna Grzmala-Buse talk about Christian nationalism or religious nationalism broadly, Christian nationalism more specifically, as an instance of identity fusion, of bringing together what it means to be Christian and what it means to be American, so that those two basically encapsulate the same idea. Now, this is the idea of Christian nationalism is Christian in the sense that it is predominantly supported by people who identify as Christians. In surveys, we do find a few of the nuns, a few of the unaffiliated Americans, and also a handful of religious minorities who will indicate some level of support for Christian nationalism. But predominantly Christian nationalism supporters are overwhelmingly Christian. Also, elites, when talking about Christian nationalism, will make references to Christian scriptures in talking about what it means to be a Christian nation or what God might intend the nation to do. But ultimately, I would argue that Christian nationalism isn't really a religious worldview. It doesn't have a set of scriptures or a set of religious practices. It doesn't have congregations, some of those other components that we think make up religion. Instead, when people are talking about ideas associated with Christian nationalism, it feels much more political. It's about who has power, who has access to power, and who's able to achieve the goals that they have within the political entity of the United States. And I would also point out that one other way that Christian nationalism doesn't feel inherently religious is because sometimes Christian nationalism will have different effects than other kinds of variables we use to capture religion. One good example is religious service attendance. We'll often ask people on surveys, how often do you attend religious services? And then when we put both religious service attendance and Christian nationalism into a statistical model to predict attitudes, sometimes they predict different directions. For example, Sam Perry has a paper out about COVID-19. And in that paper, he's asking who is taking cautionary behaviors around COVID. So who's wearing a mask, who's trying to social distance out of concern for the well-being of other people. And he finds that religious service attendance increases that pro-social behavior. Christian nationalism decreases it. So sometimes we find that the other more traditional ways we measure religion, like religious service attendance, are predicting attitudes and behaviors in very different ways than what we see with Christian nationalism. So what does Christian nationalism look like? So this is a distribution using the Whitehead and Perry measure. It comes off of the Baylor Religion Survey, and there are 6 different items that they use and combine to create a measure of Christian nationalism. These include statements like the federal government should declare the U.S. to be a Christian nation. The federal government should advocate Christian values. There should be Christian prayer in public schools. Christian symbols should be displayed in public spaces, those kinds of items. And what we find is that there is a pretty nice distribution of Christian nationalism support across the population. So we do have some folks that are very strong rejectors of Christian nationalism who are really opposed to all of these items. We have others that are strong supporters of Christian nationalism, what Whitehead and Perry call ambassadors. And then we've got a lot of folks that are in the middle that maybe slightly lean towards or slightly lean against the idea of Christian nationalism. Another component of Christian nationalism isn't just a worldview or an ideology, a set of ideas about how government should be structured. But Christian nationalism has also been talked about as an identity. So Paul Djupe and I, about a year ago, had a chance to ask people on a survey if they consider themselves to be Christian nationalist. Do they take on the label of Christian nationalism? And we found about 23% of Americans did. So within the world of Christian nationalism, we have both Americans that support the ideology of the worldview and also Americans that actively identify as a Christian nationalist. So far we've talked a little bit about the racial and religious background of the United States, the landscape, and about how we think about Christian nationalism. How does Christian nationalism relate to race? There's been a few different ways that have been proposed in the literature to describe connections of Christian nationalism to whiteness. So the first was one of them is articulated by Robert Jones in a 2023 book, and it relates to the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was a doctrine that was articulated by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, and in that edict, the Pope argued that any land that was not already inhabited by Christians was available to be claimed and to be ruled by Christian rulers with the purpose of spreading the Christian religion. So Jones writes that Christianity allows itself through the doctrine of discovery to basically get wrapped up in the idea that one of its key purposes is to be a justification of European domination of other people around the world, and that the church decided to lend its moral and religious authority to the project of colonial domination by white European powers. And now, Jones argues that this doctrine of discovery becomes a worldview that evolves over time. And in the case of the United States, it ends up being used to rationalize the genocide of Native Americans and to rationalize slavery, both of which are instances of the idea of sort of creating a Christian nation running into racial diversity. Another way of thinking about the relationship between Christian nationalism and whiteness is articulated by Gorski and Perry in 2022. So they argue that Christian nationalism is, in essence, like a deep story about what America is and who Americans are. And this deep story goes something like this: that America was founded as a Christian nation by white men who were traditional Christians, who based the founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, on Christian principles. The US is blessed by God, which is why it's been powerful and wealthy. And the United States has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity. But that all of these blessings that come from God, that have been given to the United States, end up being threatened by cultural degradation from un-American, namely unchristian influences, and that these influences can come both inside and outside the borders. Now, in this deep story of Christian nationalism, Gorski and Perry say the story has its heroes. These are white, conservative, native-born men, and that the villains are usually people of color, religious outsiders, gender and sexual orientation minorities, and sometimes women. A third way of thinking about this connection between Christian nationalism and whiteness is articulated by Alkir et al. In an article in 2024. So she starts with the observation that in the United States, it is not considered polite in most circles to talk explicitly about whiteness and sort of white supremacy kind of in politics. And yet, elites and politicians may want to signal that they're allied with whites, that they have ideas of whiteness on the top of their head, on the top of their minds. So Alkir theorizes that instead of talking about whiteness, some of the discussion about Christian nationalism in a Christian nation may be acting as a dog whistle. Instead of talking about race, there's discussion of religion instead. In order to test the theory, they field several experiments in which they expose respondents to elites making claims of anti-Christian bias. And they find that when respondents are exposed to those claims of anti-Christian bias, that they tend to perceive increased anti-white bias as well. So Alkir argues that there's a link between making claims associated with Christian nationalism and activating concerns about whites' place in the United States. Now, all put together, some colleagues and I call these ideas a racialized Christian nationalism hypothesis, that Christian nationalism is fundamentally a white phenomenon that supports white supremacy. So there's some different components of this. First, that Christian nationalism is concentrated among white Americans. Second, that it's related to racist attitudes. And then third, that it's at its root a tool of white supremacy. So the first complication that comes about when it comes to this Christian nationalized hypothesis is that we don't find Christian nationalism just among whites. This data is taken from the General Social Survey in the United States. And the first graph on the left charts support for Christian nationalism over time during the 4 years that this particular item was asked. And it charts that support divided up by different racial groups. So the red line represents Black Americans. And you can see that across the years when these ideas about Christian and American identity are fused, when that question is asked, that Black Americans show considerably more support for that idea of identity fusion or of Christian nationalism. Whites and then racial others also show some support for the ideas of Christian nationalism, but never as strongly as what we find among Black Americans. And another thing to note is that in 1996, that idea of racial identity, what group you place yourself in, mattered quite a bit to your likelihood to support Christian nationalism. By the time you get to 2024, though, racial identification, the group you place yourself in, matters less. The differences between Blacks, whites, and racial others is smaller in 2024 than it was in 1996. Now, the graph on the right is showing how racial attitudes affect Christian nationalism support and how that's changed over time. Now, this index is what we call racial resentment. It's a set of items that ask, for example, about whether respondents agree that if Black Americans just worked harder, that they would eliminate disparities in the United States system. Now, in 1996, it's true that those that are more racially resentful have higher symbolic racism, score higher on the Christian nationalism index. But if you look over time, it's always true that that racial resentment translates into more Christian nationalism support. But by 2024, racial resentment does a lot of the work when it comes to explaining who's going to support Christian nationalism. So over time, these racial stereotypes have come to matter a lot to Christian nationalism, maybe in a way that's greater than just racial identification by itself. So again, Black Americans tend to be the strongest supporters of Christian nationalism within the United States. White and Latinos tend to be about the same. Paul Djupe and Brian Calfano had the opportunity to collect a pretty amazing data set a few years ago in which they sampled American Christians. Their sample included 1,500 white, 1,500 Black, and 1,500 Latino Christians, which allows us to get more confidence about the estimates that we have than what you can get in most traditional data sets. And what we found again is that Black Americans, again, support Christian nationalism more than white and Latino Americans do. We also asked about what predicts Christian nationalism support for each of these three racial groups. And we find that the results are pretty similar. So being more Republican, having a more conservative ideology, attending worship services more often, and identifying as born again, all increase Christian nationalism support, and education decreases it. And what's interesting is that for these variables, these effects are pretty similarly sized for each of the different racial groups. So that's telling us that Christian nationalism is sort of influenced by these factors at about similar rates. And then finally, I had the chance to ask whether people have different understandings of what Christian nationalism means on a survey a few years ago. So I put these different items on the survey and asked how much are they characteristic of a Christian America? So is equal opportunity an important characteristic of what a Christian America would look like? What about family values or law and order? What about racial equality? And then I was able to compare Black and white respondents. This line of 0 down the middle is where basically would indicate that Black and white respondents are giving the same answers about what a Christian America looks like. And this graph is showing that nowhere are Black and white Americans differing in a statistically significant way in their understanding or importance of these different items for a Christian America. Okay, so Christian nationalism seems to be something that many that members of various ethnic groups adopt. So the next part of the racialized Christian nationalism hypothesis has to do about its relationship to race-related attitudes. Multiple studies have found that Christian nationalism is correlated with racialized attitudes. So Christian nationalists are more likely to oppose racial boundary crossing in marriage and adoption. They tend to be more tolerant of racists compared to other outgroups. They tend to be more supportive of ICE, including ICE actions in the last few months. They tend to believe that the United States was intended to be a promised land for European Christians. And they tend to see racial diversity as a national hindrance. So all of these are fairly well established within the literature. But that raises a question not just about whether Christian nationalism is associated with these racialized attitudes, but whether different racial groups apply Christian nationalism differently to policy attitudes. And what we find is for racialized issues, they do. So this again is from that data set of 4,500 American Christians. And one of the items was about teaching race in American history in public schools. Black respondents are the blue line on this graph. So as Black respondents become more Christian nationalist, they tend to agree that there should be race taught in American history. Latinos, which are the red line, and whites, which are the green line, show a decrease. As they become more Christian nationalist, they would prefer less teaching about race in American history. We see a similar kind of dynamic when we look at police reform. Within the United States, police actions are heavily racialized, and so there's a really strong racial component here, even though the question itself doesn't reference race. And again, we find as Black respondents become more Christian nationalist, they advocate police reform. As white and Latino respondents become more Christian nationalist, they become more opposed to police reform. And there's some evidence too that Christian nationalism itself could be triggered by racial crimes. This is from an experiment I ran with white Americans, in which I asked people just the standard Christian nationalism questions. Some respondents, half of them were given this picture of a kind of white people with the questions. The other half of the sample was given a picture of Black people with the questions. And I wanted to see if just priming race by showing pictures of people of one racial group would change support for Christian nationalism. And I found among whites that it did, but that it was highly dependent on those stereotypes. So when folks saw the white racial treatment, their probability of really strongly supporting Christian nationalism was about 0.15. People who weren't very racially resentful, who believed that Blacks were included in the American story and were important parts of American society, they didn't really change their Christian nationalism support. But respondents who didn't see Black Americans as being part of the country, who really didn't like the idea of Black inclusion, when they saw the pictures of someone who was Black with the Christian nationalism questions, it triggered an increase in Christian nationalism. So this is some evidence that there is some priming effects among whites, and whites specifically, where Christian nationalism itself can be manipulated by different racial primes. So far we've talked about issues that are very explicitly racialized, that reference race explicitly, that are very closely tied to race, but not all issues are. Sort of a level down in terms of racialization would be economic types of issues. So in the United States, there are clear racial disparities when it comes to economic issues. But when you look at public opinion data, these aren't as thoroughly racialized as some of the issues that we talked about a few minutes ago. So using this same data set of American Christians, we asked whether government should let each person get ahead on their own. And here, those differences between racial groups become a lot less dramatic than what we saw before. So, Black respondents are less likely to agree than Hispanics, less likely than whites. But Christian nationalism increases agreement slightly for all of these different groups. We see a similar kind of dynamic when we look at whether the government is responsible to care for the elderly, the sick, the unemployed. This has like a kind of racial overtone to it, not as strong as policing did, but there is some racialization here. And again, we see Christian nationalism increases agreement with, or increases disagreement, basically, this is reverse coded, with the government's obligation to care for the elderly, sick, and the unemployed. Maybe even a slightly stronger effect for Black respondents than for whites and Latinos. So there's still some racial differences in Christian nationalism, but we're seeing that effect shrink as we move to a less racialized issue. And then finally, we look at some cultural issues. So in the United States, things like abortion and other cultural issues are really much more strongly tied to ideas of religion. We've had religious organizations, like organizations on the religious right, that have made these issues feel very tied to issues of morality and religion. So we anticipated that a lot of the racial differences would begin to disappear in terms of how Christian nationalism affected attitudes on these issues. And that's what we found. So as Christian nationalism increases, so does support for making abortion illegal in the entire country. And there's very little difference in how Christian nationalism is operating between Black, Latino, and white respondents. Another issue that has been in the kind of in current events has been the idea of service exemptions. So if a business is owned by someone whose religious beliefs lead them to oppose same-sex marriage, for example, can that business deny services to gay or lesbian people if that would violate their religious beliefs? And what we find is that for Black, Latino, and white respondents, as Christian nationalism increases, so does agreement that small businesses should be able to have religious exemptions from having to provide services. And again, the respondents are really kind of having the same, Christian nationalism is having the same effect for respondents across all of these racial groups. Lastly, we looked at same-sex marriage, which again has been an issue that's tied much more tightly to religion. As Christian nationalism increases, so does support for banning same-sex marriage in their state. And this is really equivalent for the racial groups, with maybe Black respondents having a slightly stronger effect than whites or Latinos. So, here we're seeing that the way that people are applying Christian nationalism is different, not just on the basis of their racial identity, but on the basis of whether that issue is triggering ideas about race or about religion or something else. So there's a little bit of experimental data to also kind of support this idea that the salience of different identities and different issues matters. So several years ago, I fielded an experiment to Black Americans. The control group just answered Christian nationalism questions. A second group of respondents read a prompt that described the United States as being a place where you can be a full American, equally accepted, if you just agree with some different tenets, things like democracy, freedom, meritocracy, that anyone who holds these values is a true American. And that's the civic treatment, or the civic nationalism treatment. And then finally, a third group read a prompt that described the United States as a place where some people are just kind of more American on the basis of their racial identity. That's the ethno-nationalism treatment. And what I found is that among non-Christians, as they were exposed to increasingly intense versions of nationalism, their Christian nationalism support decreased. But the response was really different for Black Christians. As the boundaries of American belonging shrunk, they became more and more Christian nationalist. So in essence, what they're seeing is that as they're becoming excluded from the nation on the basis of their racial identity, instead they're emphasizing their Christian identity and their centrality in the nation by focusing on the idea of Christian nationalism. So in other words, Black respondents are responding to different circumstances by emphasizing different parts of their identities based on the salience of race and religion. So this is all a bit of a puzzle, right? So in some circumstances, Christian nationalism seems to be strongly correlated with racial issues. Racial groups take very different positions. In other instances, it seems as though there's no real difference between how racial groups are using their Christian nationalism to inform their public opinion. So why might this be the case? Well, Paul Djupe, Brian Calfano, Anand Sokhey, Andy Lewis, and I have a theory or an alternative way to think about Christian nationalism, that it might be a fairly flexible ideology that can protect the group that's salient. So different issues can make different identities salient. When I think about taxes for education, what comes to mind for me is my identity as a parent. When I think about taxes for supporting domestic violence shelters, I think about my identity as a woman. So different identities can be brought to the fore in different situations. We argue that Christian nationalism can be flexible in responding to different kinds of situations as different groups are made salient, and that it can ultimately be a way to sacralize the interests of the group that are salient at the moment. So Christian nationalism basically allows people to say that whatever their group is that they're thinking about, that's applicable to the story at hand, that Christian nationalism is a way to sort of put God's blessing on the interests of that particular group. So when race is salient, Christian nationalism can sacralize racial group interests. When religion is salient, like in the abortion or same-sex marriage context, Christian nationalism sacralizes those religious group interests. Now, if this is true, then Christian nationalism should be associated with a general sense of loyalty to groups. On this particular survey, which again included these 4,500 American Christians, we did ask about loyalty to group in kind of the framework of the moral foundations literature. So these items asked about how important it was to be loyal to your group and how important it was to be loyal to your country. And what we found is that for all racial groups, as Christian nationalism increases, so does the importance of being loyal to a particular group. Another way to think about Christian nationalism as in-group protection is to think about whether they're perceiving discrimination against Christians. Again, these are all Christians within the sample. As Christian nationalism increases, so does this perception of discrimination against Christians. And it's very similar across the different racial groups, maybe slightly stronger for Black respondents. So the main takeaways here, number one, the US has a diverse religious and racial landscape that's becoming more racially and religiously diverse over time. Number two, that Christian nationalism is quite widespread, that it is held by a large number of people that span racial and ethnic divisions. But that those racial and ethnic identifications might not, that they matter, but that racial stereotypes might matter quite a bit too. Third, that Christian nationalism is sometimes racialized, but that really depends on the issue. And then finally, that Christian nationalism can function in a more flexible way as a kind of in-group protection that sacralizes the in-group of whatever group happens to be salient at the time. So thank you so much for listening. Those are my main takeaways, kind of what I've been thinking about lately. So I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Brooklyn. I mean, very dense. It's a puzzle. I would personally need some time to digest and think about the question. Let's see if any of my colleagues in the room has some comments or questions, and you can open the microphone, open the camera if you want, or just open the microphone, or just post it in the chat. Yeah, I mean, it's quite impressive. Thank you very much. I see Issy there. Thank you. Issy, go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Brooklyn. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. This isn't even my area of study, but I thought it was really, really fascinating. So thanks so much. One thing you mentioned was that education, as education increases, if you like, then the tendency to Christian nationalism decreases. I mean, are you able to say a little bit more about that? I wonder because like I have quite a lot of friends in South Texas who are very strongly Christian, and they do a lot of homeschooling. Like everyone there seems to have been homeschooled. Is that what you were referring to in the sort of education, or was it more sort of government, state education. Yeah, I mean, if you're happy to say more about that, I'd love to hear it. Thanks.
Thank you,
So
Izzy. Brooklyn, do you mind to see if there is maybe another question and we can couple two, or if not, you can go ahead. Is there any other question at the moment? Yeah, Brooklyn, you can go ahead and maybe give some time for people to think. Yes, thank you.
Okay, sure. So thank you for that question, Issy. So when we ask on a survey about education, we're just getting a pretty broad view. So our questions are usually like, have you completed high school? Do you have an associate's, which in the US is 2 years post high school, a bachelor's, which is 4 years, some graduate school. So we're thinking just kind of in terms of numbers of years of school, not necessarily what kind of school that they're getting. I think your intuition that that they're, that the type of school matters is important. So I actually homeschooled for quite a few years myself, and what I found was that a lot of the curricula really are quite Christian nationalist, and homeschooling is growing in the United States. What I find interesting, though, is that the fastest growing component of homeschoolers here are secular homeschoolers, and also people of color that are pulling their kids out of school to homeschool them instead. And so there's been a pretty robust growth of homeschool curricula that sort of pushes back against that Christian nationalist narrative. But I think like for most of our people, once they're talking about college education, then they're getting into these environments where they're going to be encountering a lot of different ideas that are going to kind of pull them out of that homeschooling bubble a little bit. For most colleges, there are a few that won't, but for a lot of colleges, they would. So I think that's sort of where we're starting to see like decreases in Christian nationalism support, is like even for those, students that maybe did have a much more kind of conservative education in a homeschooling environment, when they get to higher education, they're getting exposed to different ideas. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was really interesting. I guess it's like the length of time someone spends within education, the more ideas they come across, the more people they mix with. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So thank you very much.
Brooklyn, there are a couple of questions in the chat. I guess you can also access the chat. Basically, one is asking in terms of the social demographics, whether age matters, and you also add region. Something I was also interested in terms of the geographical distribution, whether you have noticed, I mean, if you are, let's say, a Black person living in a southern state, is it different than someone is living in, I don't know, on the East Coast, the Black person living in the East Coast, and again, someone is living rurally? It doesn't matter whether it's urban, rural, there is anything correlation in relation to that. And then there is also a second question. Maybe you can read yourself. You can give access to the chat.
Yeah, I do. Yes, I'm looking at those questions right now.
Yeah, so the second is, does the research show a correlation between Christian teachings such as do unto others or welcome the strangers and Christian nationalism? So yeah, between the doctrine and Christian nationalism.
Those are both great questions. I'll tackle the second one first, just because it's more top of mind for me. So Paul Djupe and I actually had this question about other religious teachings and whether those might matter for softening people's sort of perceptions around how they connect their religion with their attitudes. So on a survey, we asked some of these questions that we thought were really opposed to Christian nationalism. So like we said, the government shouldn't like formally endorse any religion, that we should have a country where all religions are kind of on equal footing, those kind of items. And what we found is that there was actually a positive correlation between Christian nationalism and what we're calling this anti-Christian nationalism. So people would say both that the federal government should declare the US a Christian country, and that the federal government should not declare the US a Christian country, which was interesting. So what we are sort of taking from that is that people hear a lot of different messages about what the relationship should be between government and religion. And sometimes they don't always know how to, like which of those they really agree with, right? They just kind of know that they've heard all of it, and it just kind of comes out on surveys. What we found, some good news, is that that anti-Christian nationalism kind of operates how we think it would. So we asked people about their tolerance for their least liked group. They got to pick whichever group they liked the least, and then we asked them, like, should, you know, people from this group have books in the library? Should they be able to run for office? Should they be able to give public speeches? And what we found is that Christian nationalists did not extend much tolerance to their least liked group. People that had these anti-Christian nationalism views did extend tolerance to their least liked group. They were more likely to do that. But then kind of in the final analysis, what we found is that, that this idea of threat really matters. So when people feel that Christians are being persecuted, that they're under pressure, that all of the positive aspects, the positive ideas, like these things of like doing unto others, you know, promoting religious equality and freedom, that none of those actually matter, that Christian nationalism becomes the only thing that really matters for driving down tolerance. All those good effects go away. So, you know, there is this positive relationship between all these Christian teachings and Christian nationalism, but they kind of operate at cross purposes. And once there's a sense of threat, kind of the more positive things disappear, and you're left with Christian nationalism, which tends to have kind of antisocial implications. And then in terms of kind of the demography of Christian nationalism, like we do find it kind of more predominant in the South. The PRRI has a really nice landscape kind of website about Christian nationalism, where you can go in and I think even at the county level, see where Christian nationalism is concentrated in the United States. Tends to be in more red states, tends to be kind of more in the South a bit. We do find Christian nationalism tends to be more congregated in older people, although we're starting to see a little bit of a resurgence among youngest folks, which is kind of interesting. Like Paul, Djupe, and I again have been looking at gender attitudes, which isn't Christian nationalism, that is kind of still in this conservative Christianity kind of arena. And what we're finding is that a lot of those really conservative gender attitudes are really heavily concentrated among the young, including young women, especially young men. There's been some talk about in the United States, young men beginning to go to kind of more conservative, sometimes nationalist churches, young women exiting those religious environments. So there are some of those dynamics about age that are in place.
Thank you, Brooklyn. I saw that one participant is typing. Meanwhile, I can ask you again, going back maybe to race. I mean, I mean, it is a puzzle because, as you said, for instance, if I understood correctly, basically, the blacks use Christian nationalism as a way of including themselves into the nation. And paradoxically, the white actually they use it as a way, actually use Christian nationalism as a way of excluding. I mean, yeah, the blacks actually they don't belong to the nation. So there is quite a contradictory. So at the same time, it seems that, as you say, it's such a flexible ideology. So exactly because everybody can see their own take on that, they can be used by the political elites very flexibly. This is quite interesting. I wonder whether would be the same case if we move out from the United States, because obviously Christian nationalism is not a phenomenon confined with the United States. In Europe, we have quite a lot, also from my own country. The prime minister belonging to Brothers of Italy is very much using Christianity, copycatting a certain Orban that comes from Hungary, but he's everywhere. And I wonder whether this sort of transnational connection, whether you also have investigated, because there are links, there are conversations that are happening within all these Christian nationalism group. And if it's such a contradictory in the US understanding of Christian, how does he how can they have a common platform? Which, yes, we understand what you mean because it's so different. Maybe said, have you looked into that? Do you have anything to say about this?
That is a really good question. I have not done any comparative work at this point about Christian nationalism in terms of looking at different contexts. One thing that I wonder a little bit about is about the role of political sectarianism and whether that makes the dynamics in the US a little bit different. So we have a lot of polarization in the United States, not just among, not just kind of about ideas about the role of government, but really getting down to like actively disliking, wanting to harm members of the other party. So it really gets into like your feelings. We in political science, we talk about it as political sectarianism. So there's kind of this layer, not just of like dislike, but you know, it's just a pretty intense kind of othering sort of thing that's going on in the United States. Like I wonder that kind of gets overlaid onto Christian nationalism in terms of like Christian nationalism provides some like clear rhetorical fuel for who the enemies are, and then also kind of the stakes of the debate that you know this political conflict is really existential and eternal, has these huge implications. I wonder a little bit about in other contexts where there's like a multi-party system, or where you don't see this kind of polarization, if Christian nationalism gets laid onto politics in quite the same way. But I think that that's an empirical question. So that would be something I would have to actively like look into. I think it's a great idea for someone to take up to look at sort of how Christian nationalism is playing in these different contexts and how it lays into politics a little bit differently.
Thank you, Brooklyn. We do have a question in the chat. You want to read it yourself while I'm asking if anyone in the chat has any last questions, because I'm conscious of the time. The question in the chat maybe asks for quite a bit of elaboration. So if you want maybe to keep it short, thank you.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so Sophie asks, if I can elaborate a bit more on traditional gender roles and misogyny or male supremacism and Christian nationalism. So again, Paul Djupe and I have been doing some of this work. We've started to put some of this out at Religion in Public, which is a blog on religion and politics. We've collected data about people's support for an idea called complementarianism, which is this idea that God created two genders, that those genders are distinct, that they complement each other, and that the functioning of society depends on people living out their gender roles. There's also a hierarchical component that biblical women submit to men in the home, and then also biblical women submit to men in the church. And we found that that is very strongly connected with Christian nationalism. Jesus and John Wayne, which is a book by Kristen Kogdeme, kind of explores some of the elite rhetoric around these ideas. But we're finding in the data that connection is really, really strong. And that sometimes those gender ideologies are even stronger than Christian nationalism when it comes to attitudes on abortion or repealing the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, or that sometimes it amplifies that effect of Christian nationalism. So those two really go hand in hand. That's a great observation.
Thank you, Brooklyn. I think we have reached, sorry, there's a last, there's just a technical question. The recording will be posted on the LUNN website. So I should say thank you very much again. Very, very informative. We learned a lot, particularly myself. I had a more simplistic understanding of race and Christian nationalism, whereas you complexify the issue much more. Thank you, everyone. I think we can say now goodbye to Brooklyn, and there will be the next LUNN talk, if I'm right, on March 18 with Jimenez talking from the London School of Economics about nation branding and in Latin America. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brooklyn, I'm gonna